Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the end of our second day. It's been a wonderful day. I hope you've seen lots of book events. I trust you all have. Can I welcome to the stage Harriet Quarrelt and Alan Johnson? Thank you.
Good evening. It's an absolute privilege to welcome Alan back to Tring, because Alan, I think you were here, you spent quite a lot of time
many
here,
times,
didn't you?
yes. I've been to this Labour stronghold many times. Really, because my sister lived here. So my sister lived in Highfield Road, in number 12 Highfield Road, from about 1969 to about 1975. So I used to come to see her and her husband, Mike. And then, quite independently, my best friend, who I grew up with, went to school with, was the drummer in my band, great band called The Area, by the way. We made a record when I was 16. You can still get it on YouTube. My strong advice is not to. Anyway, Andrew moved here as well, in the High Street, lived over a shop in the High Street. So I had my best friend and my sister migrating to Tring.
Yeah. Well, welcome back.
Thank you.
It's so great to meet you because I've been absolutely fascinated by your books. So it's really good to meet you. And I have read 2 of your memoirs. You have 4 memoirs. This is the first one. And also now, obviously, your novels. So it's so fascinating to read about your so varied life, from musician, as you said, to postman, to General Secretary of the Union of Communication Workers, to MP for Hull, to Home Secretary. So pretty amazing, life. And now you are an acclaimed writer. So your autobiographies, I think, have won lots of prizes: the Orwell Prize, the Autobiography of the Year. And your novels have been very well received as well. I love this one review I think it was by Hunter Davies. Not content with being a top politician and a very nice bloke, he turns his hand to writing 4 memoirs which win awards and sell bucket loads. God, I was spitting with envy. I absolutely loved Alan's new thriller. It's brilliant. And
You read that again.
And this is Alan's newest thriller, the second one, which we will talk about in a moment. But I just wanted to start by asking you a little bit about your first memoir, This Boy, which I absolutely think it's the best memoir I've ever read. I absolutely loved it. It's about your very challenging childhood in the old Notting Hill. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Harriet. I'm at that stage in my life, there's a few other baby boomers in here, I think, where what I describe as my youth is described by others as social history. So I was, when the electorate dispensed with our services in 2010, I'd been a cabinet minister, I'd been 11 years as a minister, 5 cabinet positions, and suddenly there was some room in my life. I was still a constituency MP, of course, but we weren't in government anymore. And there was a bit of a clamour for an Alan Johnson book. And I think what they really wanted was the kind of bog standard political memoir. I don't know whether any of you read them. I don't. I mean, I find them turgid. It's generally going back and fighting old battles that everyone's forgotten to say that you were right on a certain esoteric issue and the person you were arguing with was wrong. And I didn't want to write that. But my agent, who's then was an American guy called Andrew Kidd. He said, why don't you write about your childhood? You've never written about that before. You've never told the full story. And the more I thought about it, you said I had a very challenging childhood. My mother had a very, very hard life. She was one of 11 children, not unusual for her generation. So she was born, she should be 101 if she was still alive. So she was born in 1921. And an Irish mother, Scottish father in Liverpool. She had 10 siblings, so there were 11 children. Her mother had 11 children by the age of 38. and then died when she was 42. Her mother, my mother's maternal grandmother, had also died at 42. And my mother was convinced there was this curse of the female line that meant she would die at 42. And she did. She had a serious heart condition called mitral stenosis, which meant she should have been living in the terrible slums we were in North Kensington. But she's the one who had the difficult life. And I had this boy really is the story of two incredible women who just happened to be my mother and my sister. So my sister, who was 2.5 years older than me, the one who lived in Tring, now lives in Australia, has lived in Australia since the early 80s. She was so mature that she had to bring me up virtually, my sister, because my mother, because she had mitral stenosis, she was in and out of hospital all the time. My father kind of did a moonlight flit when I was 8, but ran off with the barmaid from the lads at the village pub. So we never saw him again, and we were very pleased about that, let me tell you, because he used to come home, beat my mother up. So she'd made a bad marriage, my mother. She'd ended up in London, having told all her relatives she was going down to London and things would sort of happen for her. She was very loath to tell them how far she'd sunk, because we were living in houses that had been condemned as unfit for human habitation in the 1930s, and they were still there in the 50s. And this kind of housing was in Leeds and Glasgow and Liverpool and all the big cities. I mean, you know, it wasn't unique to West London. It's about where Grenfell Tower is now. And you mentioned Notting Hill. I'm trying to reclaim North Kensington because this whole swathe of West London has become known as Notting Hill. Whereas we never called it Notting Hill. Notting Hill was the posh bit down, you know, London West 11. This was London West 10. And my mother ended up in those conditions. And so this boy, I tell the story how one Christmas, my sister, when she was 10 and I was 7, she cooked my Christmas dinner because my mother was in hospital and my father, who hadn't done the moonlight flit then, but he'd spent the Christmas with his girlfriend, didn't come home to us. So we were left entirely alone. Linda cooked my Christmas dinner. I told her to her face, it's the worst meal I've ever had to endure in my life. Because everyone paid for a Christmas hamper then. It was sort of twopence a week, and you got a Christmas hamper with a Dundee cake and some crackers or whatever. And my mum was in hospital. She told Linda to pick up the hamper and to go to the butcher's to get the chicken. It's always chicken in those days. And Linda put the chicken in the oven, and we went off to hospital to visit my mother. She didn't realize you had to take the cellophane off the chicken first. So when we came back, so that was an awful meal, but it's indicative of how my sister virtually, brought me up. And when my mother died, Linda was 15 and I was 13. And she's the reason why we weren't taken into care. So should I tell that story now?
Yeah, well, she convinced the social worker that she could look after you.
So what happened, when my mother died, my sister said to me, don't say anything, don't say a word to anyone, or the authorities will come and split us up. And that was fine as a strategy until they started pulling down our street, ironically, to build Grenfell Tower and places like that. So by then we were in Walmer Road in North Kensington. And a letter came through the door, addressed to my mother, who died months before, offering her a council house. Now, my mother spent her whole life on the council waiting list, dreaming of her own front door, the offer of a council house. It's the only way anyone got out of those slums. The idea you could buy your own house. Some people perhaps could, not my mother, on her own, charring, cleaning, just to scrape the pennies together. So Linda, when this letter came through, marched round to the council, said it was a council house in Welwyn Garden City. I'm rather pleased we didn't get it, otherwise Grant Shapps would have been my MP. But just leaving that to one side. It's a council house in Welwyn Garden City. Linda marched round to the council, said, my mum's dead, but me and my brother will have this. She had this curious notion, my sister, that if your parent was on the council waiting list, then you kind of took their place when they died. It didn't work like that. And the councillor said, look, the age of majority then was 21. It hadn't come down to 18. So you weren't an adult till you were 21. You're 15, your brother's 13. I'll send someone round. And into our life came Mr. Pepper. the social worker, who became a hero to us, but it didn't start very well. Mr. Pepper had obviously done a bit of homework, came into one of the 2 rooms we had in Walmer Road. I was sitting there as well, made this little presentation. Alan, I've got you foster parents near your school in Chelsea. Linda, who'd left school at 15 to train to be a nursery nurse, you can go to Dr. Bernardo's at Barkingside, their big headquarters there. You can carry on your nursery nurse training and live there as well. And Mr. Pepper paused, I think, expecting a round of applause. Instead of that, my sister tore into him. I can see her now, hand on hip, waving her finger under Mr. Pepper's nose. You are not going to split us up. So Mr. Pepper went away with this big Linda-shaped flea in his ear. And people tell, social worker, well, Alison, who brought me, works in welfare, people tell me it would be impossible to do this today. But Mr. Pepper went away, came back and said, okay, I've got you a council place. And Linda went to look at it. And I didn't go, Mr. Pepper didn't go, she went on her own. Now, we'd lived in some terrible slums, but Linda told me this place, the council must have thought, 2 bits of kids, will give them the worst place on the books that we can't get rid of to anyone else. Linda told me the previous occupants had taken off the interior doors to burn as firewood. She went to look at it, marched over to the telephone box. It's by way of letting you know what my sister's like. Put her 4pence in, pressed button A when Mr. Pepper answered. Oh, hello, Linda. About this place, we're not accepting it, Linda said. And Mr. Pepper said, Linda, do you know what I've been through to get you this? She said, well, you go and look at it. If you think you can live there with your family, come and look me in the eye and tell me. We never heard of that place again. We got this lovely 2-bedroom masonette, number 11 pit house on the Wilberforce estate in Battersea. We had to go south of the Thames. That was traumatic for us, but eventually we got over that. We got over that. And we lived there very happily for 2 years until my sister got married to a lovely boyfriend who came from Watford, who'd put a down payment on a semi-detached in St James's Road in Watford. And Linda wanted me, it was 3 bedrooms, she wanted me to go with her. I said, I'm not moving to the north. It's ironic given that I represented Hull for 20 years and still live up there. But anyway, so I went back to London, to North Kensington, to live with a family that my mum knew, and then was in digs from the age of 16. But, if it hadn't been for Mr. Pepper, who came round every 5 minutes, when we got number 11 Pit House, he was there all the time. I mean, he'd have probably got the sack if something had gone wrong, Mm. And he saw that we were okay, and then he came round less often. Linda invited him to her wedding, but he didn't go. But we always say, and Linda was over actually from Australia in the summer, in September. We came here. We came here to have a look at Highfield Road because she wanted to see it again. And we've always said, Mr. Pepper was the man, that decision, listening to us, was the reason we had happy lives. Certainly much happier and more fulfilled than our mothers.
Yeah. Tell us about your English teacher as well, because you said he was a massive...
Yeah, I dedicated the first, we'll get around to talk about these in a minute, but my first thriller, Late Train to Gypsy Hill, which was published last year, I dedicated to Peter Carlin, who was my English teacher for 1 year at Sloane. And I didn't have a happy relationship with Sloane Grammar School in Chelsea. I wasn't there very often for a start, but I was interested in English. And that was my mother again. She dragged me and my sister to Ladbroke Grove Library almost as soon as we were old enough to walk, well before school. She had there were no books in her house. She'd never been a reader. And she didn't take library books out for herself. I never remember her reading a book. She was convinced, get words into children's heads, and you could read whole tracts about the importance of this now, as we're at a literary festival. It was instinctive for her. She took us to the children's section, which is still down in the basement of Ladbroke Grove Library. And so I loved books. So I wasn't having a very happy time at Sloane. When I was 14, Mr. Carlin became our English teacher. I left when I was 15, so it's just 1 year. And he was just the most amazing. I mean, all of us have got at least one great teacher, haven't we? Some are lucky enough to have more than one. I know you're a teacher as well, Harriet. and an English teacher. So this is a kind of peon of praise to you. But Mr. Carlin had this was the age when every teacher was licensed to beat you. I got caned for all kinds of things. I was a reasonably well-behaved kid. Didn't stop you getting caned. Mr. Carlin didn't need corporal punishment. Mr. Carlin had a mellifluous voice that when he spoke, it was authoritative, and you listened to Mr. Carlin. And he it must have been in his early 30s. So he was a bit kind of, bohemian. His hair was a bit, this was the age of the Beatles now, it's 1964 we're talking about. His hair was a bit longer than the other teachers. He wore the ubiquitous English teacher's corduroy jacket. They get them issued out, I think, as a uniform. And he took us boys, it was all boys, so he introduced us to George Orwell. And we all read Animal Farm, handing the book round between our hinge-lidded desks, reading a page and passing it on. And this fabulous story of the animals taking over the farm. But Mr. Carlin explained the subtext of the Bolshevik Revolution. This was a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were going out into a world divided, a third of the world's population lived under communism. And it was an introduction to politics as well for us. Not that he was making any political point beyond Orwell's warning that totalitarianism doesn't only exist on the right. I mean, this was only a decade or so, like 20 years after the war, less than 20 years after the war. It doesn't exist on the right with fascism, it exists on the left. This is where communism is heading towards totalitarianism, was the warning. And so that was an experience. He chalked on the blackboard, because there was no whiteboards then, of course, he chalked Wilfred Owen's Anthem for Doomed Youth, which disgracefully has just been taken off the national curriculum for some reason. And he pointed out, the rifle's rapid rattle, that's alliteration. And he took some of us boys to the theatre at his own expense, boys who'd never been to the theatre before. We went to see Oblomov with Spike Milligan and Half a Sixpence, the musical with Tommy Steele. And he took a real interest in my reading and my writing. He saw that I loved reading. He said, have you ever read Geoffrey Household? Have you ever read C.S. Forester? Have you ever read Arnold Bennett? Have you ever read Dickens? He introduced me to Dickens. Read this, Alan, see if you like this. And perhaps more importantly than that even, my silly detective stories I used to write about Inspector Andrews and a character called Mr. Midnight that was loosely based on the Saint. He would encourage me to submit that as homework. And then he said to me, Alan, have you ever thought about sending these off for publication? I mean, he was being kind to me because, they were rubbish, really. But he said, and he got this old dog-eared copy of the Artists and Writers Yearbook, still published in this internet age, has the address of every magazine, no matter how obscure. Send off your poems and your stories. See if you can get them published. So I sent these off, got the inevitable rejection slips. Mr. Carlin said, Alan, with this mellifluous voice, every great writer could paper their walls with rejection slips. Don't give up. And 56 years later, my first thriller came out. So of course I dedicated it to Mr. Carlin because he's still around to mark my homework. I tracked him down. He's 92 now, living in Bath. And his son, one thing I have to tell you, he doesn't remember a single thing about me. I mean, why should he? He's had hundreds he went on to be the head teacher of a big London comprehensive, had a very distinguished career in teaching. Why should he remember me? You remember them. Of course you do. They don't remember you. And I realized he didn't remember me because I'm a politician, and I know a politician when I see one, and he was being a politician, because when I go round Sainsbury's in Hessel, near my old constituency, people come up to me and say, Mr. Johnson, do you remember me? I came to your constituency surgery in 2001 about the problem with my drains. Now, if you said, no, of course I don't remember you, they'd be hurt. So you say, yes, I remember you. And Mr. Carlin's was a yes, I remember you. But anyway, his son, he was too frail to come to the book launch, which was actually held in the Savoy, by the way. It's another story. My publisher seemed to think that the hotel in the first chapter of The Late Jane Gypsy was the Savoy. It wasn't, but I wasn't going to tell them that because they had the launch reception in the Savoy. And Mr. Carlin was too frail to come, but his son did a little video message of Mr. Carlin in his garden and emailed it to me. And, you know, he said, Mr. Carlin said, he had a glass of bubbly. Alan, I just want to say, and as soon as I heard his voice, I kind of sat up straight. And I find it impossible to call him Peter. Call me Peter, but he's Mr. Carlin, you know. So great teacher. Yeah. So Mr. Carlin and Mr. Pepper didn't know each other, but they had a huge influence.
And your sister, who?
And my sister, of course.
Just, amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about your second memoir? So, Please, Mr. Postman, because you then went on to become a postman. It sounds like you really enjoyed the job, and I imagine you've got a few stories from your rounds.
The only criticism I've got, Harriet, is you've just skated over my rock and roll career very quickly. Because
I did have a question about that, but I was saving it for
later. I just want to get it in chronological order. So I left school at 15 with Andrew, who lived on the High Street in Tring, as the drummer. We formed a band called The Area. And I mean, the lead singer was the guy who drove us around, had all the money, had all the contacts. He was really old. He was 20. Me and Andrew were 15 and 16, playing in pubs that we weren't allowed to drink in, you know. But anyway, we were a good little mod band. And the record, Regent Sound Studios in Denmark Street, when I was 16, we really thought we were going to make it. And then another band called The In-Betweens that was multiracial, which was very unusual for 1967. They came and hired me. Andrew, incidentally, went off and had an audition with the Mindbenders, the great, you know, groovy kind of love, and was shortlisted to be their drummer, but didn't quite make it. And so I thought, you know, The In-Betweens, I'm going to have a real rock and roll career. And then all our gear got nicked. And I
several times, didn't it?
Well, with The Area it got nicked, but I kept my Hofner very thin guitar, Verithin. Beautiful, sunburned red, cherry red, Venetian swirls, Bigsby tremolo, beautiful. Mother of pearl inlay. Shall I go on about that? That was my guitar. Anyway, that hadn't got nicked when the Fourth Feathers Club got broken into in Edgware Road, and our gear got nicked with the Area. And then I got recruited by the In-Betweens, and then all their gear got nicked, including my Hofner very thin guitar. That, in a sense, my mother had bought me. So when we got going with the Area, I had a Vox Solid guitar, and that got our flat got broken into, as it had several times when I lived with Linda. And those 2 years, we got broken into about 3 times. And so the Vox Solid got nicked just as the Area started going. And I said to my sister, I've got to have an electric guitar. What do I do? And I'd seen this Hofner very thin in a guitar shop in Wardour Street. And my sister said, my mother had apparently squirreled away 40 quid in a post office savings bank account. I don't know how she did it. She never had 2 pennies to rub together. But she squirreled this away for us. And my sister said, look, I was going to give you this on your 18th birthday, but if you really want that guitar, there's this 40 quid. And so thanks to my mother, posthumously, I got my 36 quid Hofner very thin and 4 quid to go and have a drink with. So that was wonderful. And so when that guitar got nicked, the bass guitarist in the In-Betweens was a West Indian guy called Sham, and he was a postman higher grade in London. And I said, he wanted me to start another band, something like the Equals, you know. And I said, Sham, I've got to get married. I'm going to get married. I need to earn some money. And he said, why don't you join the post office? He said, the wages are lousy, so they can't recruit any staff, which means there's tons of overtime. 6 hours at time and a quarter, second 6 hours at time and a half, everything else, double time. So if you do the hours, you can bring the money in. So I became a postman. And I tried to describe in Please, Mr. Postman, you know, first of all, that the GPO that I joined, it was the GPO. We were uniformed civil servants. There was a thing, I mean, people talk about social mobility now. It wasn't mentioned then, but I met many senior civil servants in Whitehall when I was a minister who'd started life as a telegram boy. Because you were a civil servant, and when you were 21, you could take a civil service exam. I think you had to wait till you were 21. And then you could go anywhere in the civil service. And there were senior mandarins in Whitehall who'd started as telegram boys. So that was fascinating. The fact that, 1 in 10 of the working population worked for this huge organisation that was telephones and posts and everything, the GPO. And the guys I worked with, because I was in a little sorting office, Barnes, London Southwest 13, first of all. And there were 30 postmen. And it was me and a guy called Brian Green, who were the only ones who were anywhere near in our teens. I was 18. Brian, I think, was 19. All the rest had been in the war. That generation that had been in the Second World War were just coming into their 40s. And some people go to university when they're 18, of course, and they're at university for... When I was 18, I went to a university because listening to these guys, they never boasted about what they'd seen. They'd seen horrific, horrendous... Imagine, at that age, some of the scenes that they'd seen, some of the battles they'd been involved in. Billy Fairs was, at Monte Cassino. Fred Dainton was on the beaches of Normandy. And there was a guy, Nobby Clark. I don't know why everyone called Clark has to have the prefix Nobby. I mean, someone might explain that to me sometime. But Nobby Clark used to go around singing Al Bowley songs. Al Bowley was a famous singer from the 40s. He'd put a pipe in his mouth. You weren't supposed to smoke in the sorting office, but he'd put a pipe in his mouth and he'd mutter all these horrible songs, and people would chuck things and say, "Shut up, Nobby," Nothing you could do to not. He was a Japanese prisoner of war for 4 years, Nobby. I found out later. So nothing that ever happened in his life would ever be as disastrous as what happened to him then. But these men were a great education. And as I say in the book, as we're at a literary festival, I've never worked with a group of people who were more literate than postmen and postwomen. And I worked for 20 years in Parliament, so you can draw your own conclusions from that. But you didn't boast about it. These were all self-educated. I went to a much bigger sorting office in Slough when me and my first wife got a council house on the Brickwell estate in Slough. And so I transferred to Slough. And, my wife bought me the new Oxford Book of English Verse for Christmas, because I was into poetry by then. But you didn't go into, I would never have taken it into the post office canteen or, walked in with T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland under your arm and show. I mean, even, you wouldn't go in with The Guardian, because people would think you were getting above yourself. So it's like a secret society. I just happened to be, because everything was done by hand then. There was no sorting, there were no postcodes, there was no sorting machines. You sorted by hand. And next to me was a guy called Des O'Callaghan, and we just got chatting, as you did when you were sorting. And I happened to mention getting this book, New Oxford Book of English Verse, and he said to me, almost like a whisper, there's a poem by a man called Henry Reed called Naming of Parts that is really terrific. He said, you ought to read it. Sort of whispered. And then he got me to bring the book in. Des was a great fan of poetry. And he marked out Yeats, and he marked out Auden, and the poems I had to read, Andrew Marvell, who I succeeded as an MP in Hull, to his coy mistress. He told me to read that. And I read these kind of things. And then he said to me, there's nothing by Larkin in here. And it wasn't, because it was up until 1950, I think. Larkin wasn't famous then. And so he introduced me to a poem called I Remember by Larkin, which is basically about Coventry rather than Hull, where he ended up. But there was that. There was a Indian guy called George Serple. There were a lot of Asian guys working in the sorting office in Slough who had been university lecturers and doctors and teachers in their own country, had come over here and had to retrain if they wanted to go back to their profession, came into the post office as a stopgap and never did get back to their profession. Well, George was a professor of literature, George Serple. I don't think his real name is George, but that's what he called himself. That's what we called him. And George Serple saw me reading one day and said, have you ever read Thomas Hardy? And he gave me Return of the Native. And, it just blew me away. All these people in the post office, Jock Hasty, who could quote whole chunks of Shakespeare until you got, you're sitting eating your beans on toast in the morning and he'd say, the quality of mercy is not strained. He was always doing these long soliloquies from Shakespeare. So that was a great education that I tried to describe in Please, Mr Postman, as well as the education of the trade union movement, which was incredible.
Exactly.
Talk about self-improvement.
Well, I think we'd better probably start talking about your novels. There's lots else we could talk about because, your memoirs are just amazing and I really, really recommend them. But let's talk about your first novel, Late Train to Gypsy Hill. So it's a brilliant thriller about, I suppose, quite a dull life of Gary Nelson, which collides with the Russian mafia. And he ends up going on the run from them and the Met to, strangely enough, Aylesbury, which I thought was really interesting. And as I was reading it, I was just sort of thinking, you obviously have got all this inside knowledge from being the Home Secretary. So obviously that's a blessing, but you also have to be a bit careful when you're writing about
Yes, you
things.
do. Well, I mean, I did the memoirs, the trilogy of my life, if you like. And then my agent, wonderful woman called Claire Alexander, convinced me to do one more memoir, which is about music, a music memoir, about my life in music, up until the time when I was 32. And I knew I wouldn't make it as a rock star, but I thought I'd still make it as a songwriter. I mean, just to give this wonderful audience a glimpse into my genius as a songwriter. When I was 18, I wrote a song about a lad with acne, called Bad Skin. I've got acne, I've got eczema, I've got every skin disease, gives me pimples I can pick, gives me blackheads I can squeeze. Now, I think you'll agree that is Dylan-esque, positively Dylan-esque. But the real genius, it was in the middle eight. How can any girl want to be with you when every kiss she gets just tastes of Nivea? I submit that as my genius as a songwriter. And in 1982, I sat down and with an acoustic guitar, recorded 4 or 5 of these songs, sent them off to Elvis Costello, got his address off the back of Imperial Bedroom, great album, if you've never heard it, at Stiff Records. And as I said in the book, I'm still waiting for a reply. So that memoir, that music memoir, once that was out of the way, I really wanted to write fiction. And I'd come to book festivals like this and say about my desire to write fiction, and some wag in the audience would say, well, if you want to write fiction, you should write your next party manifesto. It's a very cynical view of politics. But this was what Mr. Carlin told me not to give up on, And to me, the memoirs won lots of prizes. I'm very proud of that. But I kind of knew the plot and I knew the characters. You have to know how to string a sentence together. But fiction to me was the challenge, to be able to create this world that other people will lose themselves in, for however long it takes to read an 80,000 word book. To me, that was being a real writer. I would never be a real writer until I did fiction. And so The Late Train to Gypsy Hill was the first one, dedicated to Mr. Carlin. And Gary's the innocent abroad, Gary Nelson, and he comes from Aylesbury and thinks that London is where everything happens. I mean, it's only down the road, isn't it? But he goes to London expecting excitement and adventure, finding just a tedious job in accounts payable in Covent Garden. And he's living in a flat with Crystal Palace with more successful people than him, his flatmates. And he's waiting for something to happen. The way he puts it to himself is he's leading a very small life and he wants to lead a big life. But he notices a girl on the train. And there's always a girl on the train, isn't there? He notices a girl on the train applying her makeup. Now, here's something that was from my experience, not as Home Secretary, but from being sent back on public transport after being a minister for 11 years with the government car service running me around. Suddenly I was on the train because my journey, I had a flat at Crystal Palace near Gypsy Hill. I'd walk down to Gypsy Hill station, take the train to Victoria, walk down Victoria Street to Parliament. And on the train, I noticed something that I'd never noticed back in the late 90s when I was using public transport more, which is the way young women, predominantly, but women of all ages really, apply a full face of makeup on the train, packed and crowded. This is Southern Rail, not a happy experience. There are commuters swarming and swaying across their path, and they've got everything out meticulously, doing it all in order. My wife told me the order it was done in. And, you know, as you go through Balham, they're applying the pay. And then when you get close to Clapham Junction, the mascara comes out, and the lipstick goes on, you know, as if they're in their own boudoirs, you know, completely private, oblivious to everything going on around them. Gary sees this girl applying the makeup, and one evening, he wants to sits next to her. She scrawls on her mirror with her mascara, "Help me." And from then on, Gary gets all the excitement and adventure he could possibly want. Now, thankfully, I wrote this sort of 5 years ago, but the heroes are Ukrainians and the villains are Russians. So I got it the right way around.
It's quite interesting. Yeah, there's a little bit of fortune telling there as well. So did your job as Home Secretary give you that insight?
That's a very good question. No, I think it did give me an insight, yes. But, you know, I did those 5 cabinet positions, so trade and industry, work and pensions, trade and industry, education, health, and then the Home Office. And the Home Office cannot be described as the Ministry of Fun. It is tough. It's counter-terrorism, it's policing, it's immigration. But it's very rewarding and very fulfilling. But you learn things that you can never talk about. I can't even talk about to my wife. You know, you sign the Official Secrets Act. Could I have used some of that material? No, I couldn't. I'd need to get cabinet clearance if I was going to go anywhere near anything that actually happened, and a lot happened during my 12 months as Home Secretary. But what it does give you is an understanding of how the security service works with the police, and how the police are as crucial to counter-terrorism as the security service, MI5. MI5 is the Home Secretary's responsibility, MI6 is Foreign Secretary's responsibility. So I understood all that, and that helped. And to that extent, it did help me having been the Home Secretary. But for the plot and everything else, I could have written that whether I'd been Home Secretary or not.
Yeah, and the detective in both books, and you're writing a third at the moment, is Louise Mangan, and she is an assistant commissioner.
Unfortunately, I made the mistake of promoting her to assistant commissioner at the end of the first book. But assistant commissioners really don't get their hands dirty. You know, they're more administrators than detectives. Yeah. And I needed her as a detective for the second.
But you kind of come up with a way of getting her to do
it. I.e. that a minister goes missing in Crete. Yeah. A British minister in the Foreign Office. Actually, it's called One of Our Ministers is Missing. If I'd have written it this summer, it would have been all of our ministers.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you that.
Or I could have put, which one of our ministers do you want to go missing? Perhaps in the jungle somewhere.
And
ex-ministers.
I was reading it at a time where that was very true. I was wondering if it was wishful thinking.
Yeah, well, so my trick was that because there's always a Met liaison, if the person who has gone missing lives in London, as this guy, Bellingham, did, then the Met would be, if they lived in Leicester, then it would be the Leicestershire police. Yeah. There's always a liaison. So the Greek police were in charge because the guy's gone missing in Crete, but they had to send over a liaison officer. And because it was a minister missing, they chose someone pretty high ranking. And that's how I got Louise Mangan back on the kind of detective side, because she goes out as the liaison officer.
And there's quite a lot of sort of internal politics, aren't there, within, you know, in the novel, in the police. Was that kind of from experience, or again, is that just fiction?
I mean, I had huge admiration for the police. I know there's a lot of stuff around now that the police have to get to grips with. But if you think about a police force, it does tend to attract, on the one hand, people who have a real desire to give something to society. And, you know, that's wonderful people who kind of risk their lives every day. On the other hand, because it's a position of authority over others, it attracts a certain personalities who like to have that feeling of power for nefarious reasons over other people. So you've always got to be careful. This is the really sad thing about this report recently about the vetting system. I mean, I have to say, my successor as Home Secretary was Theresa May. She cut the police by a fifth. A fifth, 20% of all police officers went. 50% of police community support officers went overnight. Now, Boris Johnson comes in 2019, says we're going to re-recruit them, but you've lost all that experience. And now what you're doing frantically is trying to recruit not experienced people, novices. And I think that's been half the problem with the recruitment processes we've been hearing about. So I have got a huge admiration for the police, but the internal politics in the police, is like in all big organisations. It's there between the different ranks, and Louise Mangan's got the people she gets on with and the people she doesn't. Fortunately, the commissioner is one that she does get on with.
But no, I thought that was a sort of interesting, extra level in the novel. So in One of Our Ministers is Missing, Louise Mangan has to go to Crete to investigate this disappearance of Lord Bellingham. Coincidentally, he's also got a kind of scandal brewing, hasn't he, back in the UK. We're quite interested in your views on political scandals. I mean, I remember when I was younger, when I was younger, people seemed to resign or get sacked for the slightest thing, whereas these days, people seem to be able to brush it off. Where are we going with this?
You put your finger on something there, that's for sure. Well, can I say one thing? My villain, if you like, is Lord Bellingham, and there is a Lord Bellingham, and it just escaped and he's a guy I know.
Oh no!
He's Henry Bellingham. He was an MP in Norfolk, and he's got a certain notoriety because it was he's the descendant of the Bellingham who murdered Spencer Perceval, the only prime minister ever to be assassinated in this country. So Spencer Perceval was shot dead by a guy who he owed money to or something. Just in the place where he got shot is still there. It's the old part of Westminster Hall where Parliament used to sit. And Henry Bellingham Spencer Perceval was walking out of Parliament, and this guy Bellingham, wasn't Henry, someone Bellingham, shot him dead on the spot. The only British Prime Minister ever to be assassinated, 1804. Henry Bellingham is the descendant of the person who murdered the Prime Minister. So I've kind of, he's had enough in his life to cope with without me. Without me putting him in the book. But it is not based on him. It's all totally fictitious. The name just struck me as, right, Bellingham's a kind of good name for a villain. Sorry, what did you ask me?
So I think I was saying, he is involved in this sort of, quite complicated scandal back in the UK.
Yes, and what a scandal.
But, what's happening that politicians just seem to be able to get away with anything and just carry on?
Well, I mean, a kind of subplot to this is has Lord Bellingham gone missing because he's the victim of a criminal act, or has he gone missing because he meant to go missing, a la John Stonehouse? It's amazing how, I hope this audience is old enough to remember, but it has to be explained to a younger generation. Left his clothes neatly folded on the beach in Miami and ended up in Australia with his lover. Now, he happened to be, John Stonehouse, Postmaster General when I became a postman. I'm not saying there's any link between me and him, but, then, in the days of the GPO, the post office was so important, it had its own cabinet minister, the Postmaster General. Clem Attlee was Postmaster General in the 30s. Tony Benn was Postmaster General famously in the 60s. And it was this guy, John Stonehouse. And it's an amazing story because the reason he was caught, so he went to Australia under this assumed identity, and everything would have been fine, except he walked into a bank in Australia and the bank clerk thought she recognised him. She didn't think she recognised him as John Stonehouse. She thought he was Lord Lucan, who'd gone missing at almost precisely the same time, about 1974, something like that. So she reported that she'd seen Lord Lucan. The police come around and find they found John Stonehouse. Now, he returned to this country didn't go back into Parliament, but, had a pretty good career after that. So, scandals are nothing new, as you're saying, but people did used to resign. I mean, famously, over stuff that was nothing to do with them at all, but you couldn't blame a civil servant. Civil servants couldn't speak for themselves. You were the minister. If something went wrong, you resigned. Now, Christ, you have to try and crowbar them out, or they go and they come back.
Yes.
After a few days. I mean, what is all that about?
Yes. So I think, are we nearly out of time, Ben?
15, so I think we need to do questions from the audience, I think.
Fine. I did think you wanted to read a short extract.
Shall I read a short extract? So this is a character in this is a contract killer, and I just wanted you to know that there are a lot of contract killers around. They're shopping in Tesco's with you. They're waiting for their kids outside the school, and I wanted to make Brady, my contract killer, human, if you like. Not a hero. He's a villain, but. This is a little bit about him. In almost 20 years, most of that time in London, Brady had never come close to getting caught. In the early days, his engagements would come by word of mouth through former colleagues in Northern Ireland, decommissioned from the paramilitary struggle by the peace process. As Brady's skills were honed and his reputation grew in Northern Ireland, he realised he couldn't risk staying in the vicinity of his former activities. He needed a bigger stage. That was when he'd moved from Belfast to London. The only thing that came with him was the false identity his former comrades had provided, the birth certificate of an infant who died in a car crash in Enniskillen 40 years ago. Once in London, he'd met Kathleen and used his new identity to get married, buy a house, and acquire a passport. Having an alter ego didn't completely separate Brady's peaceful domestic existence from his far from peaceful professional life, but it helped. He knew that his crimes evaded detection because of the absence of motive and because he was careful. As for the morality of it, and Brady considered himself to be a moral person, he had his rules. He only killed adults, never children, would have nothing to do with torture, and avoided killing priests and peace activists. Any job that involved the Middle East was refused. Mossad was too ruthless, Palestinian terrorists too fanatical. And while he occasionally contracted with organized crime, he insisted on remaining completely independent. Brady was an elite maestro, not a mob hitman. As for method, he preferred the bullet to the blade, marksmanship being his particular area of expertise. But he wasn't averse to other means of disposal, explosives, strangulation, falls from a great height. Once he'd even slipped a lethal poison into a hospital meal to fulfill a contract against a man who'd survived a near-fatal shooting. Near-fatal was not good enough for Brady. He'd also used poison when a contractor stipulated that no violence was to be used against the victim. A curious consideration, but it was not for him to question why. On that occasion, he'd hijacked a pizza outlet scooter to deliver a Hawaiian with extra pineapple and added strychnine.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
So, do we have any questions?
Sorry.
Oh, this one.
You have to wait for the microphone if that's all right, but we've got one back here.
Like you, I was at Sloane in Chelsea from 57 to 64.
Right.
My first question, do you remember me?
Yes, I remember you, of course.
I'm quite relieved. My second question, what are your views about grammar schools? And where might they be going in the future? Or will they not be going anywhere, but going out of the system?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of grammar schools. I know present company, they're brilliant teachers, obviously. I mean, the thing was, when me and my sister passed our grammar, passed our 11+, And we were my mother was absolutely delighted about that. To her, that was a kind of route out. But you know, there were so many bright kids in my school, Bevington, who didn't pass that exam and went off to the god-awful, for the boys, Isaac Newton's secondary modern at the bottom of the Portobello Road, that was like a blackboard jungle. I mean, one of my incentives for passing was I didn't want to go there. There were kids like Peter Hayward who passed, but his parents couldn't afford the uniform. I soon found out, as me and my mother trailed around being interviewed at Walter St John's, at Clement Danes, and finally at Sloane, that it wasn't my mother seeing if the school was good enough for me. It was the head teacher seeing if I was good enough for the school. Got refused at Clement Danes, got refused at Walter St John's. Lots of kids, untold story by the way, passed their 11 plus, went to secondary modern because the grammars wouldn't accept them. It is to me a barbaric system where at age 11, you choose the bright kids that go on to get a good, well-funded education, and the kids who are not so bright. As my kids, I lived in Slough, so I lived on a Brickwell estate. They still, because it was Buckinghamshire up until 1974, it had grammar schools. My daughter has still not recovered from failing her 11 plus. My son passed. I saw as a parent the difference that it made. So I don't think we'll ever, to quote a great conservative education spokesman, selective education doesn't spread opportunity, it cements it, is my view. Sorry, it doesn't spread advantage, it cements it, yeah, not opportunity. But it's great to see you again, Tom.
I've got a...
And you'd remember Guy Boas. Guy Boas was our head teacher, great head teacher, yeah. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I've got one question
over here.
online, and then we'll come to this chap here.
Okay.
Rowena, if you were a government minister today, would social media change your approach, and would it make you nervous?
Well, social media was around, you know, in 2010. It wasn't to the same level, and I didn't get involved in social media at all. But it would make me nervous. I was probably the last of a generation that didn't have to be on Twitter or whatever. MPs now, I think, are seen as not serving their constituents if they're not available on those social media platforms. It kind of now comes with the job. It didn't for me. In fact, I remember the first email I ever got. Hull West and Hessel was not a kind of email-y constituency, if you like, but I remember the first email I got in '98, and me and my staff were saying, "Hey, look at this. This will never catch on." So yeah, I think it's the cause of a lot of bitterness and a lot of hatred and a lot of intolerance that was probably always there, but now there's a platform for those people and they use it. So for all the good that's come out of social media, I think there's an awful lot of bad as well.
And Andrea Ledson was here earlier, and she was saying the amount of mental health issues within Parliament are exacerbating at the moment, and it's almost entirely down to issues with social media. Yeah, we used to call about the letters in green ink. When it was letters, that the people who were writing to you who had mental health problems. Andrew was probably talking about the staff having mental health problems, was she? Or? No, but parliamentarians.
Parliamentarians, yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah, well, try being in the police. There's one there.
Are you still a Beatles?
It's not working.
I can hear you.
Could you put?
Are you still a Beatles fan? And if so,
sorry,
what do you make of
it's turned. The online crowd can't hear the question. Could you bring the microphone back?
Shall I repeat?
It's coming. It's all right.
Hello, that's better.
Thank you.
Are you still a Beatles fan? And if so, what do you make of Giles Martin's reissues?
Yes, I am still a Beatles fan. So all 4 of my memoirs. This Boy was the B-side of I Want to Hold Your Hand, as you already knew. And it was a song I sang when I auditioned for Peter J and the Jaywalkers, which is a band some of you might remember. I never got the job, but we had to do This Boy, which made it a nice title for the first book. Then Please Mr Postman, not a Lennon-McCartney song, but on the Beatles' second album. And then Along a Winding Road and In My Life was the title of my music memoir. The Beatles changed my life. The Stones couldn't even change their chord formation. I don't want to upset you Stones fans, including my sister.
We're doing a Stones event on Wednesday or Thursday.
Oh, I love the Stones. I love the Stones. I do like the Stones. But if you're talking about who took popular music, the evolution of popular music from like three-chord stuff to incredibly complex stuff, Eleanor Rigby, Day in a Life, the Beatles, everyone followed in their wake. And I think they're great. And I love the stuff that Giles Martin is doing, all the reissues I get. And the fact is, the year of lockdown, the top 10, so our parents and all that, my mum, who came from Liverpool, we thought she'd loved the Beatles. She was just about still alive when they became famous. She couldn't stand them. The Bachelors were her favourite group. But so everyone said to us, oh, don't get carried away with the Beatles. You'd have forgotten them by next Christmas. Lockdown year, they were number 6 in the top 10 with Taylor Swift, Ed Sheeran. People were listening to Beatles music, and they always will be, because they're fantastic.
Any more questions? We've got one over here. Oh, and I think we might have questions up there, but I can't see. Should we go up there?
Yeah, let's go up there. We've got a microphone.
Hello. The Metropolitan Police clearly have issues. Would you split them between national and local responsibilities?
Sorry, say that again, the last bit.
Would you split the Metropolitan Police's responsibilities between national and local, so they have so you have a different person heading up the national section of their responsibilities from their local policing?
Yes, I think that's something that we should look at. But that's secondary to looking at the real issue. We have 46 police forces in this country. 46. You don't need a police force. You don't need 46 police forces. And everyone knows that. They're just frightened to go anywhere near it. Because if you have, so the reason why the Met are so powerful is, in a sense, they substitute for a national police service. They have one in Scotland now. But we have the police broken down into so many different agencies. And then you have different agencies on top of that. So I think it's complex, and part of the reconstitution of our police, which is not far different to when Peel set it up, in 1830 or whatever. And thank God Peel's brilliant foresight still exists. He said our police should be civilians in uniform. You go to other countries, they would die for our police let's not put it like that, but they would, in terms of corruptibility, in terms of trust in the police force, we are still incredibly fortunate compared to some other countries. But I think there is a practical issue that the latest inquiry has thrown up, which means that the Met really should look at doing exactly as you say, and putting the national stuff to one side and the local stuff, concentrating on the local stuff. Can I just say on the local stuff? PCSOs were really, really important. Police community support officers. And the reason they're important is because they stayed within the community. So neighbourhood policing was a sergeant, about 3 constables, about 4 PCSOs. Every neighbourhood knew, you had a phone number you could ring for your local neighbourhood policing team. That's all gone. And the PCSOs, because they never had to pursue a case in court, and so were always on the streets, and because they came from those areas, they were as crucial to counter-terrorism, MI5 would tell you, as anything, because they fed back stuff. And things like county lines and drug running, they would be crucial now, but they've been cut to the bone. Hardly any left.
I've got an online question, which is quite a good one, actually, from Shirley. What were your reasons for not standing as leader of the Labour Party?
That's an awful question, Shirley.
It's great for us.
Because I didn't want to do it, and sometimes I feel guilty about that, as if you're letting down your party. But there were better people to. So whenever someone wanted me to stand, it was always to stab someone else in the back, whether it was Gordon Brown or whether it was Ed Miliband. I mean, when we came out of government in 2010, was the only time I would have kind of thought about it. But I was backing David Miliband. In fact, I backed him on the Today programme before he'd even put his hat in the ring. So in a sense, I sort of, I was in advance of him. I thought he was better than me, if you like. And I always thought there's someone better. Gordon Brown, I mean, Gordon Brown, during that international crisis we had that began with Lehman Brothers collapsing, the rest of the world, including Obama, thanked Brown for leading them out of that crisis. You know, he was lauded, he won prizes all around the world, but not in his own country. He's a very serious politician. I wasn't going to, you know, stab him in the back and step over his prostrate body to lift the crown. So didn't want to be, really, is the answer to that, Shirley. And I'm sorry about that if you wanted me to be, but I think if you don't want to be the leader, it shows, and you won't do it very well.
Have we got time for one more question over here? Was there a question over here?
You're an example of someone who went into Parliament after quite a long life's experience. These days it seems to me that graduates, and they're pretty well all graduates, the candidates in both parties, go straight and find themselves a job as a researcher or something in Parliament without any experience at all. Do you think there's any way persuading either of the major parties in their selection methods to take that into consideration?
It's a very good question, and I think all the political parties are cognizant of that now. There was a period when David Cameron led the Tories, Nick Clegg led the Lib Dems, and Ed Miliband led the Labour Party, and they'd all come virtually through the same route. Got a degree, usually in PPE, from Oxford or Cambridge. Then found ended up coming in working for an MP. Then before long, they were working for the party or working for ministers. Then a seat was found for them. Hey presto, they're leading a political party without any discernible experience of life outside politics. But of course, the answer is the people who local constituency parties adopt as their candidates. And I think now, I mean, there was a postman just before I left, adopted by the Conservatives in Cornwall, proper postman. And people say to me, oh, I was a postman. No, you weren't. You were a Christmas casual, you know, for 2 weeks. It's not the same thing. This guy, Scott Mann, was a postman adopted by the Conservative Party in a seat in Cornwall. And I think that was indicative of people getting really worried, wanting to bring people in who had experience of life. So I think that will change. There's Clive Efford was a taxi driver. For all those people who think it's a shame that people who really know how to run the country are too busy driving London cabs. There's one London cabbie who is now an MP, Clive Efford. And so I think your point is well made, but only political parties can change that. And I think they are beginning to realise that it does need to change. Keir Starmer, for instance, I mean, did a job that is much more important and difficult than most cabinet positions, Director of Public Prosecutions. He was my DPP when I was at the Home Office. I mean, that is a proper job.
We're going to have one more question from this chap here, and then we'll call it.
We on? First of all, can I put your mind at rest? I went to St Clement Danes and you didn't miss much. I've written a small biography of my mother's life and the family surrounding. And one of the biggest problems I had was I felt there were things I had to leave out. And I just wonder, in you writing your memoirs, whether there were things that you felt that you had, and obviously I'm not asking you to disclose them now, but were there things that you felt that you had to leave out?
That's a very good question. And the answer is yes. You know, and the good thing about writing the biography and not other people is you, as Churchill famously said, I know that history will be kind to me because I intend to write it myself. So you choose what to leave out. I mean, the things I left out were nothing in terms of the story. The story about my mother and my sister is the story, and it's, you know, they were two incredible women. But there were bits around it that I thought I won't mention that because there might still be people alive and it would hurt their feelings or whatever. So you do, yeah, you as you did, you self-censor, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Alan. It's been so brilliant to have you here. I can't recommend the memoirs highly enough. Unfortunately, I did say to Ben we ought to do an auction for this book. This is the only one we've got currently. Oh, and one here. But we are going to get some more as soon as possible. So please do come back to the bookshop and and get some more of the memoirs, because I would highly recommend them. Plus these brilliant thrillers as well, which you will really enjoy. And Alan is kindly going to sit here, Ben.
There.
Here,
That's where the table is.
He's going to sit here and sign books. So if you've purchased one or you'd like to do so now, please form an orderly queue. But can we give Alan a really big thank you?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That was so good. Thank you.
Thank you.